This is William Wordsworth, a prolific English poet who lived from 1770 to 1850. He is best known for helping kickstart the English Romantic movement in poetry, and he was also known for his criticism of poets at the time. And this is Paul Laurence Dunbar, an American poet who was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1872 and lived until 1906. He went to Howard University and was known for writing poetry centered around black issues. Though they are from two different time periods and they have lived very different lives, they share a similar message in their poems London, 1802, and Douglas. Let's examine these poems more closely. The title of each poem is vital to establishing the setting with which these poets work with. Wordsworth titled his London 1802, which establishes not only the setting, but also the time period. Meanwhile, Dunbar titles his poem Douglas, after the abolitionist and activist Frederick Douglass. This distinction establishes one of the underlying themes of this poem, that of race, which is part of his central focus. Both of these poets built their ideas into a crescendo using a Petrarchan sonnet, which is a 14-line poem that is split up into two different parts, an octave and a sestet. The rhyme scheme of the Petrarchan sonnet outlines the enclosed rhyme ABBA. In an octave for this sonnet, the rhyme scheme is repeated twice. After the octave comes the volta, which is a radical tone shift that leads into the sestet. In a traditional Petrarchan sonnet, the sestet uses a rhyme pattern CDE, CDE, or CD, CD, CD. The beauty of the Petrarchan sonnet lies in its use of iambic pentameter, which creates a smooth rhythm that emphasizes the ends of each line. In that manner, the Petrarchan sonnet is often used to describe a situation before shifting to what could be a possible solution. For instance, this is a classic example of a Shakespearean iambic pentameter, placing emphasis on soft, light, yonder, and breaks. As such, both Wordsworth and Dunbar employ this rhyme scheme in their poems. London 1802 opens by invoking the name of John Milton, poet and author of Paradise Lost. Bringing forth Milton's name also brings forth a major religious theme, as Milton was a biblical purist, believing that the Bible was the only source of religious devotion. Thus, he struggled with the established religions in England. In the first pattern of enclosed rhyme, Wordsworth states that England is a fen of stagnant waters. Through his description of a flooded, barren fen, Wordsworth suggests that England is a wasteland of moral decadence. As no sustenance can grow in a fen, nothing is cultivated in English society. Wordsworth continues to build the octave as he outlines the problems that make English society a wasteland. He delineates that altar, sword, and pen are the primary factors that have forfeited the ancient English inheritance of inward happiness. Simply, false religious authority, or the established religions, war, and degenerate literature have hijacked social conventions, and thus have created unhappiness and gloom. Leading into the next enclosed rhyme, Wordsworth establishes these sources of unhappiness as the purveyors of selfishness, leading to the zenith of the octave, which is simply a clamor for John Milton to raise society up again. The crescendo bred and raised in the octave cascades in the sestet, which shifts the tone from one of despair to one of hope, as Wordsworth employs a particular rhyme scheme to outline Milton's qualities, and in turn outline the qualities of a good leader. He establishes in the first line of the sestet that Milton's soul was like a star, and that states that Milton's voice was like the sea, pure as the naked heavens. An allusion to Genesis, in which creation was first only sky and sea, Wordsworth outlines the purity of heart and voice necessary for a leader to bring forth positive change. He also outlines the necessary power and attitude of a leader in the next lines, in which he identifies Milton's cheerful godliness, but then establishes that ultimately Milton has the forced duty to deal with lowliness. In outlining Milton's qualities, Wordsworth solidifies that a leader of Milton's caliber must appear to rid society of these illnesses. Much like Wordsworth, Dunbar employs the Petrarchan sonnet, the only difference being that the rhyme scheme in the sestet of Douglas has a different pattern. Douglas employs a similar style in that he addresses the subject of his poem directly, notifying Douglas that we have fallen on evil days. Dunbar recalls when Frederick Douglass, whom he characterizes as the eyes of that harsh long ago, maintained a position of power so that he saw himself at the cross of devious ways, meaning that Frederick Douglass was essentially a leader and a guide for the country at a crossroads that only led to either racism or acceptance. Dunbar then notes that all the country heard him with amaze, establishing Douglas as the kind of leader who is able to unite people regardless of their ideologies, regardless of their backgrounds, and regardless of their race. Dunbar shifts, talking about the passionate ebb and flow of Frederick Douglass's speech and of his activism, noting that it was an awful tide that battled to and fro. In characterizing the battle against slavery as an awful tide that struggled to and fro, Dunbar recognizes that the struggle for civil rights was very difficult, and that it was virtually a struggle between good and evil. In the end of the octave, Dunbar then writes that society currently rides amid a tempest of dispraise, meaning that there is currently a lot of criticism and scorn for the progress that has been made, thus causing a deterioration in race relations and also a regression in the status of blacks in society. Dunbar's Volta changes the tone of the poem from one of despair to one of hope, as does Wordsworth's. Dunbar establishes that when times get tough and when the waves of swift and violent dissension swarm, that honor, a strong pilot, whose voice is higher sounding than the storm, must guide the shivering bark to obtain comfort and to be able to survive through the troubling times. Dunbar characterizes a good leader as one with honor and one with a voice, specifically a voice that is strong enough to unite and to overcome the voices of the storm or the voices of the critics. Dunbar personifies the idea of honor to represent a person and to also call back to Frederick Douglass, whom he sees as the perfect embodiment of such honor. Dunbar also notes that the person of honor must have a blast-defying power of his form, meaning that his voice and his ability to unite must be enough to defy the blasts that may come unto them. Dunbar establishes a dark tone at the end, not to produce hope, but to find hope in the lonely dark. And he establishes that this person of honor, this figure, must be strong enough to be able to give comfort to the black community in the United States as they struggle through these times. Though Wordsworth and Dunbar tackle different societal ills in their poems, both London 1802 and Douglas emphasize the need for leadership like that of old, for leadership that will find the ability to purge society of toxic and dangerous diseases like selfishness and racism through purity, virtue, strength, and most importantly, voice.